What's up, guys? This is part 2 of the ACL Q&A. If you want to learn about the part 1, which we talk about load management after ACL, how to get back into basketball, and why you could potentially tear your Achilles after ACL surgery, click the link here. This is part 1. But let's just jump into part 2 already. It's jam-packed with a lot of great questions. So Gabe, why don't you start us off?
Question by username Oblivion4581. He asked, or she asked, how does one know if their surgeon is good and won't mess up their ACL surgery? How long until they're able to play or be able to get into physical therapy? And the second part is, what's the process like for those that are overweight or obese when they get injured? And how does one keep weight off while they're recovering or rehab? So Marco, let's get into the first part first of how do you know if a surgeon's good and won't mess up your ACL? And then how long or how quick do you see someone in the PT clinic?
Yeah, those are great questions. That's like one of the most common questions we get asked is like, who should be my surgeon? What surgeon should I choose? And I tell people there's a lot of factors in there. One, don't be afraid to shop around. But one of the main things is you want to go with the surgeon that does a lot of ACLs. Find out what their track record they do. You know, you don't want a surgeon that only does 2 ACLs a year. You want several ACLs a year, and you also want to see that they're operating on individuals to the similar activity level that you are. You know, that's why there's certain surgeons that work with certain sports teams because they're accustomed to seeing, you know, let's say soccer, a lot of people with ACLs. But one is figuring out how many ACLs they do, and two, and we talk about this in a different video on different graft types, because as we talk about with ACL is sometimes they could repair your ACL, but most of the time they reconstruct it, so they need to grab a graft from either your body or a cadaver. So you want to find out what graft that surgeon's comfortable with. If that surgeon's comfortable with using the hamstring, but from all your research you're like, hey, I want to do the patellar tendon, that might not be the right surgeon because he does a lot of hamstring. You want to go with the surgeon that's going to give you the graft that you want to do. But it's also kind of, you know, a communal decision. But don't be afraid to shop around and finding out, one, how many ACLs they've done, what graft are they familiar with, but the most important thing is the rehab. But Gabe, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I think Marco nailed it. We get this question asked a lot from not only clients but like friends and family of like, who do I choose as a surgeon? And like Marco mentioned, it's like you got to shop around and figure out their success story, what graft they're comfortable with, and like the population that they work with. And don't be afraid to shop around. You got to ask the right questions, and at the end of the day, it's your body and you're choosing somebody that will do the job for you, and they are doing that job. So you got to make sure you're comfortable with your decision, with the graft that you want to choose. And as much as we want to give like our recommendation, what we see as success with when someone rehabs with us, we often defer to the surgeon and like your comfortability, because the surgeon is the one that's performing the surgery and they need to do their job, and they're going to do whatever they can to make sure your ACL graft is solid and secure medically. So you got to do your due diligence of finding the graft that you want to use, and there's a bunch of information. We have a video, a whole thing on ACL graft choices, and then you got to figure out which surgeon you're comfortable with. So look around, see what works, and yeah, it's a very important decision. So don't choose it quickly.
Yeah, and even more important decision is the next question is, when do you start physical therapy? And also, I'll tie that in, finding the right physical therapist. You want to find a physical therapist that's aligning with your goals. If you go to a clinic and you see, no offense to geriatric patients, but a lot of older individuals, the highest dumbbell is maybe 10 pounds, then you might have to go to a different physical therapist. But the biggest thing is you want to start early with ACL and often, because you want to regain your motion early on, get everything going. And the earliest I've seen people is like 2-3 days. I mean, honestly, I want to see them 2 to 3 days so we can kind of tell them what you can't do. Is it okay to do this? Should you ditch the crutches? Should you ditch the brace? Little things like that is when you need a physical therapist early on. That's why I encourage people to, otherwise, if the surgeon says not to, but most of the time they've been okaying a lot of people at 3 days post-op, but want to get there as soon as possible within the first week if you can. What do you think, Gabe?
Yeah, I think it's very dependent on the surgeon, and we often defer our recommendation when someone comes into the surgeon because the surgeon is there for that specific job we just talked about. It's like making sure the graft is solid and safe for you to begin physical therapy, because there's a lot of factors that could make you unsafe to start physical therapy. And then to piggyback off what Marco said, it's like seeing us early is massive, because not only you get things moving and get things activated early, it also puts you at ease a little bit. It's like a lot of times we see clients in the first couple of days and they're like terrified. They're like, they don't even want to touch their knee. They're afraid to touch the brace. They haven't even looked at their injury site or wound site, because it's a scary and traumatic thing, and you really just, some people just don't know, and you don't really, sometimes you come out of anesthesia and the surgeon talked to you but you don't remember. So it's one of the ones where seeing a provider like us will put you at ease so that you know what you can and cannot do, and you could just get things moving, get things going.
No, for sure. Earlier the better.
Earlier the better. And which goes into the second part of the question. What's the process look like for those that are overweight or obese that got hurt, and like how does one keep the weight off while they're rehabbing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in regards to the actual rehab, if you're overweight, obese, it doesn't really affect the rehab per se. We're still going to be doing the same things. However, you may increase weight early on in the first 2-3 weeks, maybe in the first month, because you're not as active. And because you're not as active, you're eating the same, so you're not burning the same amount of calories that you were. So you might increase weight even for the active individual, the individual that is not overweight, obese. You'll see an increase in weight early on because there's not that many options early on. And since a lot of times you're not doing much, and people are maintaining the same lifestyle, that increases the weight. But there's a lot of exercise you can do with your upper body to burn off some weight. You can use, upper extremity bike, any upper extremity movements. However, just to kind of fair warn you, early on people do gain weight, but then it goes off, as you increase your dynamic activities and everything. But aligning your lifestyle to those changes, that, hey, I'm not going to be as active, so let me just decrease the amount of calories that I'm having. But I still encourage people to eat as much protein as they can, because they're building up that muscle, and that really affects with their recovery. What do you have, Gabe, for that?
Yeah, I think first thing is when someone comes to us when they're obese or overweight, obviously we can't change what they're coming into us as, but my question would be is, if they do happen to ask, it's like, is your goal to lose weight? And then that's where you have the conversation of like lifestyle changes. Do they need to see a nutritionist, a dietitian or something to help start losing weight if that's part of their goal. And by losing weight as well, it helps with the knee rehab, because you put less stress and load onto the joint meniscus and potentially the ACL graft secondarily. So it's one of the ones where you got to make lifestyle choices if you want to change kind of like the overweight part of it. But that's got to come from your end, and making sure you want to make that change, because exercise itself alone isn't going to make you lose weight. It'll help for sure, but being conscious of like the calories in, calories out, making sure your intake of protein is enough during this time while you're rehabbing. And what Marco mentioned is you can do cardiovascular exercise while you're rehabbing. You just got to make sure you don't have a DVT after surgery. You want to make sure you're cleared by your general practitioner or a cardiologist to make sure you're safe to do cardiovascular exercises, and that includes like upper body bike, ski erg, battle ropes, upper body movements. So there is ways to keep the weight off, but most of it comes down to nutrition.
For sure. Let's go into the next question. So we have user AKAL POV, Akala POV. Which month after ACL reconstruction with the hamstring graft, so they use the hamstring to replace their ACL, can I start doing Nordic hamstring curls? And those are the ones that you guys seen probably online, where the person's like falling down while someone's holding them at the knees, or they're using something to hold them at their ankles/knees and they're bent extending. What do you think, Gabe? This is kind of a tricky question.
Yeah, I mean, to answer the question directly, I don't think I've seen anything personally from research on when it's safe to, like month-wise, for the graft and the hamstring tendon to tolerate Nordic hamstring curls without a potential tear. But with that being said, clinically, we do Nordic hamstring curls a lot for this population. But with that being said, we don't jump from nothing to doing
100,
Nordic hamstring curls, because it's a very demanding and tough hamstring specific exercise. So we do a proper ramp up to be able to do that, and some of that includes like isolated work with the hamstring, like supine heel digs, double leg RDL, progressing from double staggered to single leg, stability, leg curls where you go into eccentric work, and then loading it up with weight. And once you're able to do that, then we progress to Nordic hamstring curl. And on top of that, with the ACL surgery, you have to be comfortable kneeling, and that can be difficult as well. So it's a great exercise to do, and we do work to that. We do it all the time with our rehab, but it is something that you got to build up to it. And just to answer the question, realistically, you probably see people like maybe 4 to 6 months post-op ACL if they are doing the proper ramp up.
Yeah, and I would say that's kind of almost like one of the last exercises we use for the hamstring. So just because the hamstring gets super weak after the ACL surgery when they grab, because they grab a piece of your tendon, and that tendon that muscle's harder to activate. A lot of people have trouble, really feeling that muscle. And to kind of disclose this, I'm not a big fan of the hamstring graft for ACL because it's a secondary stabilizer for the ACL. It helps the ACL. So a lot of people are already quad dominant, especially soccer players, basketball players. So the quad's really strong, hamstring glutes aren't strong. So if something's already weak and you get a piece of their tendon, it gets even weaker. So that, it's a recipe for a harder progression. So that's why, like Gabe said, you have to have the proper progressions. Start with isolated exercises and move into those single leg RDLs, double leg. But in my opinion, the hamstring curl is more towards the later stages, like Gabe said, 4 to 6 months. And we have to do it because it's going to help decrease your risk for those hamstring strains, especially once you start sprinting, because you're really going to be putting that load in that hamstring. And it's just a tough exercise. I mean, if the hamstring is not strong enough, what's going to happen is you're going to start using the other hamstring. And if the hamstring isn't strong enough on the right side, sometimes you may overdo it and strain your hamstring doing the exercise itself, because it's active lengthening of the hamstring, and that's how you kind of pull it, stretch it. But there's different progressions, and we'll make a video on different progressions of exercises for hamstring activation, strengthening after ACL, because I think that's a big one. Because you can't just jump into this exercise. You have to have the right steps, the right movements before you get there.
Yeah, and it's one of the ones where if you did choose to do a hamstring graft, you got to be doing Nordic hamstring grafts. It's like you have to do it. You just got to make sure you get there, kind of what we were saying with this whole thing. So yeah, it's one of the ones where get it to a point where you can do it, and then you need to be doing it 100%. Quite often. Yeah. Okay, so final question that will wrap it up for our Q&A session here is asked by the Real Jarova, and they asked, is cracking and popping sensation in the knee normal after ACL surgery?
Great question. I think this is probably the most common question, but the biggest thing is, one of the questions I ask them is, does it hurt? If it doesn't hurt, it's totally normal. We see that all the time with ankles, every joint, but if it does hurt, it requires more investigation. Like, hey, why is it hurting? Where is it popping? Is it more in the superficial in the patella, or is it more towards the lateral, deep inside? But if it doesn't hurt, it's totally fine. Actually, sometimes they feel good. You know how some people are like, oh, it cracks and it feels good, it feels more mobile? Because sometimes when you're stiff, you may have these little gas bubbles, they might pop. It's like cracking your knuckles and it feels good. Sometimes there's little swelling in the knee joint, maybe causing that cracking, popping sensation. Or sometimes the patella isn't tracking correctly, quote unquote, and it might give you some cracking, popping. But as long as it doesn't hurt, you're fine. What do you think, Gabe?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. It's always the first question is, does it hurt when it happens? And if it doesn't, it's actually very normal for joints to make noises. It's like, it's shown that things move around, air bubbles release, kind of what Marco was talking about. And that's for any joint. Like when, I don't know, if someone sprained their ankle, like when you move their ankle, sometimes it pops more, like tissue changes when you have an injury. And when you have that initial tightness that happens after an injury or surgery, and you increase movement, mobility, function and strength, you'll start to notice that popping happens actually more frequently. And if it doesn't hurt, it's actually a very positive sign. So I think the first question is always, does it hurt? And if it does, then we need to investigate a lot more, because there are a bunch of different potential sources of the pain. So if you do have pain when things crack, and like, not like, oh, it's like that doesn't feel quite right, like, no, like if you have pain, not like you're like scared of it popping type of thing. So if you do have it, please seek advice from a healthcare provider to get properly evaluated, but make sure it's not just like a fear type of situation.
Yeah, and it won't lead to arthritis. I know a lot of people are like, hey, my knee's popping. It won't, but there's other factors. You having ACL surgery increases your risk already for arthritis, but not the popping.
Correct.
Just a heads up. Awesome, man. Those are some good questions. Hopefully you guys learned a lot. Those are solid questions about ACL rehab. And if you guys have any questions regarding these questions, comment below. But we're gonna try to do this more often. So we're gonna create a new poll once this video gets published on a different topic. And if you guys have any questions, just ask them there. And we're gonna try to answer every question as detailed as possible. We usually choose the top ones, but it's a good way to really learn more about these certain injuries, and we'll go further into detail. And we'll post the references down below too, so it's not the information that we're making up, it's not all lies. It's coming from expertise and also backed up from evidence. But yeah, if you guys have any questions, comment below and hit the subscribe button. Gabe, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think we try to answer as much as these questions as detailed as we can be. A lot of it depends in the rehab world, and we hate giving that answer, but it is very much depending on a lot of different factors. So feel free to ask us more questions on the questions that we did answer. And we do want to get away from just ACL. We want to answer a bunch of different questions, because it is a popular topic, but there are a bunch of other things you could ask us. Any other injury, you could ask us personal questions about like what we do in our career and stuff like that. We just want to get you guys more information and learn from us as much as we can. And kind of what Marco mentioned, a lot of this is our own expertise for practicing for so long and what we see, but we're also very much research based, and we use evidence to help guide our treatment and making sure we're most up to date. So that's why we're providing the references, and we just want to provide content in a different way. So if you do like this, we'll try and do it more frequently, especially if we get a lot of questions, and we'll try and do some lives. We're running through some kinks obviously with this camera and shooting longer videos like this, so any feedback is more than welcome. We're very much trying to learn on how to present this content, so we appreciate you guys sticking in with us, and like always, it's ball for life.